A gale-force wind of political change stormed through Scotland this summer, with the SNP's dominance at Westminster upturned by Labour. The SNP, though, is still the party of devolved government, and support for independence remains largely unchanged. So, welcome to Dundee, once dubbed the Yes City for its overwhelming backing of independence. But Labour won all but one of the 9 Westminster seats around here in July. Tonight's audience reflects a general electoral picture across Scotland. Welcome to Question Time. From the Scottish Government is Jenny Gilruth. She's been Education Secretary since March last year and MSP for Mid, Fife and Glenrothes since 2016. Having been Labour's only Scottish MP for a long time, Iain Murray now has lots of friends on the Westminster benches, with the party winning 37 seats here in July. And he now sits in the UK Cabinet as the Secretary of State for Scotland. The Conservatives' Andrew Bowie is Shadow UK Minister for Veteran Affairs and Energy. He's one of only 5 Tory MPs in Scotland, but his party is still the second largest in the Scottish Parliament. Wendy Chamberlain is Deputy Leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats and Chief Whip to their 72 MPs. She's been the MP for North East Fife since 2019. And Iain Macwhirter is a veteran observer of politics. He writes for The Times and Spectator and is a former rector of Edinburgh University. His book, Disunited Kingdom, examines Scotland and the UK after the independence vote 10 years ago. Good evening. Welcome to our panellists, welcome to our audience here in Dundee. Great to see you, and welcome to you at home. Remember, you can join in the programme on social media, and you can watch the programme at 8 o'clock live on iPlayer if after the 10 o'clock news is a bit late. 8 o'clock on iPlayer. Right, let's take our first question, which is from David Patterson.
Good evening, panel. Does handing back £6,000 get Sir Keir Starmer off the hook?
So, this is a story, I think it broke last night, it's all in the papers today. So, Keir Starmer has handed back some £6,000 worth of gifts, 6 Taylor Swift tickets, tickets to Doncaster races, clothing rental agreement. He has not handed back money for tens of thousands of pounds for clothing, football tickets and the like. Iain.
I guessed you might come to me first on this question.
I wonder why.
Well, look, David, I mean, it's the question of the time at the moment, and I think it's really important to say that the reason we're talking about this in the media and in the public at the moment is because of everything being transparent. You know, this has come about because the public registers have been updated with the pre- and post-election register of members' interest, and that's the right thing for that to happen, and that's how we're here, because of that transparency.
Well, if it's also fine, why is he handing back £6,000? Well,
he's taken the view that since he became Prime Minister, he's handed back the money. He hasn't actually handed back the money, he's paid for them himself. These aren't cash value, you have to attach a cash value to a ticket in kind. But, I mean, politicians, businesses, the media, everyone on this panel, were invited to a plethora of events and organisations, either in our own constituency or nationally, and we make a judgment call about whether or not we take those up. And
so do you think he's right to hand back the £6,000?
Well, the 2 questions you have to answer yourself is it transparent and honest? And that's, yes, it is transparent and honest. And the second thing you've got to ask yourself is, has there been any undue influence played on these kinds of issues? And the answer to that is quite clearly no. And the government have shown since 90 days ago, when we formed the government, that we've taken on some of the vested interests, ticket pricing being one of them, a football regulator being another, and I know Arsenal
let me ask you
in the news recently.
Do you think Keir Starmer is right to hand back the £6,000?
Well, I think he's right to, if he feels that that's the judgment he wants to make, I think he should do so. Given there's 2 big things that have been announced alongside it. One is to tighten the ministerial code, and the second one is this really strange thing about making sure that the MP's register of members' interest has equivalence with ministers. I mean, Andrew will know this, he was a minister before. MPs have to register everything in their register of financial interest within 28 days. Ministers don't. So we're going to have to bring that together to give that equivalence,
well, let me ask you
even
then,
more transparent. But there's nothing here gone wrong. Nobody's broken any rules here.
Okay, so
it's all transparent in the public domain.
Let me ask you then, because a couple of weekends ago you accepted hospitality to go and see Liverpool v Bournemouth, paid for by Salmon Scotland. Do you think you should be handing the money back for those tickets?
Well, it's what I've said before. We go to a lot of events under a judgment call to engage. I mean, Salmon Scotland is the largest exporter of food in the United Kingdom. They employ a lot of people. I was up in Shetland a few weeks ago on a ministerial visit. Salmon was a great conversation there. So
but
really
why do you need to go to a football match to engage with Salmon Scotland? I mean, couldn't you just have a meeting?
Well, you engage in a lot of different ways. It was in Liverpool because party conference was there, so we were all in Liverpool.
But Salmon Scotland is based in Edinburgh, and you're an MP in that area. Well, I mean, why don't you just have a meeting with them?
Let me give you an example. I went to the...
Well, why don't you address that one? Why don't you just have a meeting rather than go to a football match?
I went to the Edinburgh Military Tattoo over the summer to engage with the tattoo because it is just outside my constituency. It's one of the biggest events that happened during the Edinburgh Festival. I accepted hospitality and a ticket to do the salute there at the Edinburgh Military Tattoo. So these are all judgment calls. Now, I can understand how difficult all this looks. I can understand the public are angry about it. I can understand some of the public don't care about it. But the bottom line here is that it's all transparent. It's all on the public register. And Keir Starmer, as Prime Minister, decided that to clean up politics, he wants to make sure that he can change the rules.
There's lots of hands up. David, where are you? There you go. Right.
My annoyance is that this word transparent, it's like a get-out-of-jail-free card for you. I would say it's transparent to who? It was transparent to the people that you have to tell, but not to the wider public or your constituents.
Well, it's on the public register.
It's on the public register. It
had to be registered publicly.
Who consults that? It should be made public to your constituents at the very minimum when it happens.
It's registered publicly, which is why people are discussing it, because Number 10 and Prime Minister decided to seek further clarity from the registrar to see if it had been registered correctly in terms of some of the things that had to be registered. So it has all been transparently put into the public domain.
The reason we're talking about today is because Keir Starmer suddenly raised it again by giving back £6,000 worth. Quite why he's chosen to give that back and not the rest of it, I'm not clear, but I might come back to you on that. Man here in the black T-shirt.
Well, I think it's important to stay on that point because he hasn't given back the Arsenal issue because he was a season ticket at Arsenal.
And the rest of the clothes?
And it was made, well, that happened before the election under a different donation, and therefore what he's done is he's given back the stuff since he's been Prime Minister in terms of the stuff that he's taken in terms of entertainment.
But why is it OK, since you raised it, I promise I'm going to get round the rest of you, why is it OK just before he's Prime Minister, but not OK just after he's Prime Minister? Because
he's realised that there's been a problem in terms of the perception in the public. It's been transparently put onto the register. He wants to clean up politics. That was one of the big things he said before the election. And my goodness, it needs cleaned up. And the rules were changed. So he wants to, what he has done is he's paid for these in advance of the review that's going to come forward in terms of the ministerial code.
A man there in the black T-shirt.
Yeah, would he have paid for them if we hadn't called him out? If it hadn't been picked up, would he have put himself forward and said, I've taken these gifts, I need to pay for them? No, he wouldn't. He would not have paid for them. Until we called him out, he would not have paid for them.
Well, the review of the ministerial code happens under every new government, and the review started well before.
But that's a different question. You're asking would he have paid the money back. In fact, I don't know whether you can be inside the mind of Keir Starmer, but certainly there's been an awful lot of adverse publicity about it. Woman here in the front.
Hello. Question. If you go to Taylor Swift's concert, you don't think, I'm going to do some work, sir. So why do you take a gift like that in the first place?
Actually, do you know, he's had 10 tickets to Taylor Swift.
Wow.
So he's dead keen, or else his family are dead keen. Yeah, I don't know. Wendy?
So I think it is interesting that the Prime Minister has chosen to give a certain amount of things back. And I think Iain is right to call out the difference between the ministerial register and the MP's register of interest. It is publicly available. That's potentially, in response to David's point, something that needs to be thought about in terms of how accessible the public feel that is. That clearly is an issue. But the ministerial register, I mean, during the last government, we had a situation where the ministerial register was not published for over a year. It was only updated on a quarterly basis. And at that time, that was sort of post-Boris Johnson, we had, frankly, a fairground merry-go-round of ministers coming on and off of government and going on to the backbenches, and potentially their doings and their declarations being less transparent than the other backbench MPs sitting beside them.
But I think what it comes down to, Wendy, because this is certainly at least the second time that that so many of you want to talk about this, is I think what it comes down to is, do people feel that MPs, cabinet ministers, prime ministers, opposition or in government, should they be accepting these kinds of things? So should you have accepted hospitality at the fabulously named British Kebab Awards, or open tickets or Scottish BAFTA tickets? Do you think that someone in your position, be you in opposition or in government, should be accepting that kind of hospitality?
So on the Kebab Awards, it was not me that attended, it was a couple of members of my staff, and we were asked for representation, and I accepted on that basis. On the open, I'm the MP for St Andrews, Golf is one of the most significant tourism attractions in my seat. I also sit on the Links Trust that runs the golf course in St Andrews. So I do think it's appropriate for me to attend events. So that was in relation to, obviously, the media bill was going through Parliament, but as well as that, Scottish Affairs Committee, which I sat on, was looking at public sector broadcasting in Scotland. So what I would say was I was quite choiceful about the things I accepted, and attending the Battle of Scotland allowed me...
So some things are OK and some things aren't?
Well, I think it's back down to the point that Tim Farron made in this same programme a couple of weeks ago about what you feel that is appropriate for you to justify to your constituents, as David rightly said, and making that judgment. Do I feel that it's appropriate that I engage strongly with the golfing industry because of my seat in North East Fife? Yes, I do, and I do that appropriately and transparently.
Jenny.
So I think Iain asked two questions at the start. So he said, is it transparent and is it honest? But the third question, Fiona, is it right? And that's really what we're grappling with this evening. I think on this, Labour have let the country down, quite frankly. I think they came in on a wind of change, the opportunity to clean up politics, as Iain said, and in some respects it seems that they're no better than the Tories.
Well, there's no equivalence to the Conservatives,
if I could
to be
just
fair.
finish.
They were breaking the law.
When we look at some of these donations, you know, the Prime Minister taking over £100,000 for suits and his own glasses.
No, hang on, the £100,000 was for a lot of things.
Including
suits. But it wasn't 100 grand on suits.
Well, indeed. Including
it was tens of thousands, admittedly.
Most of us pay for our own clothes in this job, Fiona. Now, secondly, we had the Deputy Prime Minister taking money to go to Ibiza, to a nightclub. And we've had the Education Secretary in England claiming, was it £14,000 for her 40th birthday party? I had my 40th birthday party in a pub in Markinch. These people are
you've
totally
got the SNP
detached.
Westminster leader,
These
Stephen
people are
Flynn,
totally
accepting tickets to
detached from
Wimbledon
reality.
and the Wembley
They are
Football
detached
Cup.
from reality.
But what about Stephen Flynn?
Fiona, the point I make is that
but
these
also
politicians
why
are
is
detached
it
from
okay for
reality
him?
of the lives that their constituents live, and that is why this is so important. And obviously, we're going to go on to talk about further instances in my own party now.
Well, I'm just going to ask. I mean, you're all going to get it. I mean, what about Stephen Flynn then? SNP Westminster leader accepted tickets to Wimbledon and
I'm
the
sure he
Wembley
would have done
Football
as
Cup.
SNP leader.
Cup final.
As many politicians do.
But that's the same as saying as the Prime Minister.
Well, why is the Prime Minister paying some of this money back and not all of it?
Hang on. Just 1 second.
On
Why is it essential to the job for the SNP Westminster leader to go to the Wimbledon Tennis Championship?
Well, you would have to ask Stephen Flynn that.
Well, I'm asking you as the SNP represented on this panel.
Well, of course.
Because you're criticising Labour. I'm just wondering what you think.
Well, he's the SNP leader, so I imagine he was representing the party at that event.
Prime Minister's the Prime Minister.
Does the SNP need to be represented at the Wimbledon Tennis Championship?
You would have to ask Stephen Flynn that question.
Sounds like you're not sure of the answer to that. OK. Andrew.
Well, look, I think there's a few issues here, and the reason that we're discussing it here tonight, and all starts off with the staggering amount of donations that Keir Starmer accepted, more than double the next closest MP in Parliament, £107,000.
More than double the current sitting MP, not as much as Boris Johnson.
Well, no, that's...
Let's just
Boris
make that
Johnson
clear.
is no longer an MP. And
sure,
he's no
but clearly he was leader of your party. He was leader of your party and he accepted an awful lot of money, some of it to pay for his own wedding.
Well, look, Keir Starmer accepted over £107,000. The reason that this is a debate is threefold. One, because a very senior donor to the Labour Party, somebody who was a significant donor in regard to that £107,000 worth of gifts, donations, suits, ties, etc., was given a Downing Street pass. And that looked to many on the outside like a donor to the Labour Party had undue influence over the new Labour government. The third reason that it's still an issue is the fact that this is all coming out at the same time when the new Labour government are removing £300 of the winter fuel allowance from some of the poorest pensioners in the country. And frankly, when pensioners across this country are genuinely having to decide this winter between heating and eating, they find it absolutely abhorrent that a man who was on a very good salary before he entered politics, remains on a very good salary now as Prime Minister, and was on a good salary as leader of the opposition, needs somebody else to buy his suits and his ties. And that, I think, is the reason that we are still discussing this today. And I have no idea, frankly, why anybody needs to go and see Taylor Swift 6 times. It's very different from Wendy, who's conducting an investigation on a committee into the British broadcasting industry, going to the BAFTAs, where all of the British broadcasting industry will be. I'm not quite sure the discussions that Keir Starmer was having with Taylor Swift 6 times.
In fairness, he didn't. I'm not saying he went 6 times. He got 10 tickets. And presumably, your strength of feeling about why does someone who's well paid need someone to buy clothes for them, extended to why does someone who's well paid, such as Prime Minister Boris Johnson, need someone to buy wallpaper for him? Presumably, you felt as strongly about that.
I did feel quite strongly about that, and you'd have to ask Boris Johnson that question.
All right, let's hear a little bit from our audience. Yes, actually, OK, yes, the woman here in the front.
Hi there. Leave Swifty alone. She's done some good stuff in life.
OK, fair.
But I think you're absolutely right.
wouldn't
Transparency, I think we haven't seen that. And it's a blip in the ocean what Keir Starmer's done. And I'm sorry to say what the Conservatives did with Sunak. It's disgraceful what and Boris. So, yes, he, like the gentleman said, he was called out, and that's why he had to come up with it. But the Conservatives have done some horrific things with money and the amount of stuff they've accepted, millions. It's a drip. It's just a little dip in the ocean.
OK. So the woman at the back end with the glasses and the stripy T-shirt, yes.
I'm curious, for your average Joe Blogs, when we do our tax returns and such like, the level of scrutiny that we're under for, you know, any gifts that we've been given, money or such like. It's fascinating to me about what level of honesty goes on at the government when it comes to gifts, because these are personal gifts as far as I can say. It's only Keir Starmer that's wearing the suits. It's only, you know, him that's going to the Taylor Swift concerts.
But there's no dishonesty here. This is all. There's no law breaking here. This is all transparently on the public register.
Is that affecting his tax?
And that's why it should be there. And, you know, Andrew,
the woman's asking, does it affect his tax return?
Well,
because he's taken plenty of tax off me, and he knows about every penny that I've got. It's actually the gall of it, the fact that you can take all these gifts and think it's perfectly fine and just take them as little freebies with absolutely no sort of consequence to it. Fascinating.
You sat there very patiently, Iain, at the end of the desk here.
Well, I'd like to declare some soggy sushi I had in the green room before I came to the programme.
Soggy, very sorry about that.
Very soggy indeed. I mean, there's a saying in politics, you probably heard, that if you're in a hole, the last thing you should do is keep digging. And that's especially the case if you're a gold digger. And that's how this Prime Minister looks like now. I mean, he's given back £6,000 today. A mystery why he's decided to give this story legs, because it was dying away. It just means that everybody asks, well, what about the other 101,000 that you've accepted in recent times? I mean, he's also placed a lot of his own ministers in a very difficult position, because at least 10 ministers have accepted Taylor Swift tickets. I don't know why Taylor Swift is such an important engagement for Labour politicians, but apparently it is. And they're all now thinking, well, you know, like Wes Streeting or Bridget Phillipson, do they have to give it back now too? So, I mean, this question about whether or not Oh, and the other thing is today, Lord Ali, who did benefit, as Andrew says, to the tune of getting a Commons pass, who gave very large sums of money in benefits in kind to the Prime Minister. Today, this very day, he is now being investigated by the Lord Standards Committee for failing, or apparently failing, or irregularities in some of his declarations. So it's appalling timing. And as somebody else has just mentioned, absolutely, this week, the very week in which the energy price cap has been lifted by £149, it's gone up 10%. 10% is a great deal for people who are in straitened circumstances, particularly pensioners who have lost £300 from their winter fuel payment. And I've also another £300 because last year they got a cost of living payment. In Dundee alone, there are 20,000 pensioners who are going to be hit by this. And this is going to cause real problems in Scotland, because, of course, bills in Scotland are much higher than the
so, Iain, what do you think the answer is to this? Because it's what I've not yet heard from the audience, and I'd like to see if there is anyone who thinks this. Everyone I've heard from so far this week, and last time we talked about this topic, was just kind of fed up and said, you know, it just looks terrible, and we don't think MP should be taking this. Where does this go? Because, I mean, obviously MPs have been offered hospitality and gifts and freebies, whatever you call it, since time immemorial. Should there be a moratorium on it now, so they can't accept anything, or has it become a bit of a storm in a teacup?
No, you've got to wind it back, clearly. I mean, it looks appalling that the Prime Minister, who's a very highly paid lawyer, who is a millionaire himself, was taking these large sums of money from Lord Ali and others to pay for his glasses and his clothes. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. Obviously, politicians have to get around, ministers have to get around, they have to go to social receptions. They can't declare every glass of wine or every soggy sandwich they get. That would be absurd. But it's all a question of scale. It's not just whether or not these you know, they were declared, or whether or not everybody else is doing it, which is what Iain is saying. It's a question of scale, and it's a question of how you present yourself. And the problem with Labour, I think, is that they, because of their long criticism of Tory excesses, they've persuaded themselves, or they've led themselves to think that they in some way are more virtuous than everybody else.
Yeah.
And that
Okay.
because they do it, it must be
All right,
okay.
let me hear a little bit more from the audience. Yes. This woman here in the blue T-shirt.
I think part of the issue is that it's abhorrent no matter what party that's done it, and we're living in a time when we're seeing more food banks, more food larders, more charities having to actually step in and do the work that the government, whether that's Westminster or in Scotland, should be doing. You know, NHS, they're only allowed to take gifts, up to £5. So maybe there does need to be a cap put on it, and let's actually put that money back into the charities that are doing the work that you should all be doing in the first place.
Let me take a final point. It's the man in the blue jacket. Yeah.
So the questions about this clearly make all the panel uncomfortable. So why not get together and legislate and outlaw the practice altogether of gift giving?
Well, let you have the final words. I mean, Keir Starmer's not suggesting outlawing the whole practice together. He's talking about some new principles, but none of them, we don't quite know what that means at this stage.
Yeah, but what it'll mean is that if you accept something, it'll have to be in connection with your ministerial portfolio, so it'll have to be relevant. And we've talked about a lot of things from military tattoo, golf, and other things. It depends on the judgment you make about if it's relevant to the role that you've got. And, you know, the BBC invite us to a lot of things, Fiona. The BBC, last night at the Proms, the Chancellor was invited and sat next to the political editor, and Nick Robinson. So, you know, should Rachel Reeves have accepted that as Chancellor? Why did she go? Why did the BBC invite her? So there's a whole scale of these things, and I think it's right for the Prime Minister to say, well, make sure there's equivalence with MPs' transparency in the first instance, and on the second instance, tighten the ministerial code to make sure it's relevant to the job. If you then change the rules and tighten the rules, maybe you can start to clear this up.
OK. Who knows? We might come back to this subject. Depends on, I don't know, something else might come out. Let's see how it goes. Anyway, I just want to tell you where we are next week. So next week, we're heading to America for the presidential election special. Of course, that is going on over there. We're going to be in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. Big, very important swing state. So that's going to be on Thursday on BBC One as normal, but at the earlier time of 9 o'clock. And you might think this is strange if you're sitting at home in Britain watching this, which, of course, most people who are watching this are in Britain, but some people watch it in the States. So if you happen to be watching this in America and you want to come and be part of our audience, apply on the Question Time website. The instructions are here, and come along, because we can have a split audience, of course, Republicans, Democrats, and those who are not sure which way they're going to vote. And we'd love you to come and be part of the audience. So that is our American presidential special, BBC One, 9 o'clock next week. And the week after that, we're in Rotherham, service back as usual. So if you happen to be in Rotherham, we'd love to see you as well. OK. So, next question, Jim Donnelly. There you are.
Diplomacy has failed in both the long-running Russia, Ukraine and the Middle East conflict. What else can possibly be done to stop this madness?
Now, Jim, I wanted to pick your question out of the many questions that have been asked about the Middle East, because it seemed to me it reflected what many of you seem to be saying in your questions, which is reflecting a sense of helplessness, that this is all going on. The UN seems powerless. America doesn't seem to be making any difference either. And the UK government does not have any impact either, as far as one can tell. Is that a fair reflection of your view?
Absolutely. Yes.
And do you have any sense of what you think could possibly be done?
Well, I'm lost now. I think the UN, as we know, the UN all these years ago was set up to try and stop any wars after the Second World War, you know, but, you know, they seem to be powerless. Russia have went into the Crimea and it was just washed aside, you know, nothing was done about that, and it's now into a ridiculous situation within Ukraine. So that's been going on for the last couple of years, you know.
Okay.
The Middle East conflict is decades long in terms of where that's going, but now it seems completely out of control, and it's difficult to see where it will end.
I mean, Wendy, we've discussed, obviously, the situation in the Middle East on this programme many times.
And it's developed since the last
calls for
programme
immediate
as well.
ceasefires right at the very beginning. Obviously, Lib Dems are calling for immediate ceasefires. You might as well have been howling in the wind, because it's made no difference whatsoever. Is there anything, really, that should we just accept that in the UK all we can do is sit back and watch?
I mean,
or is it anything we can actually do?
I think it's important as politicians and parties to recognise that our influence can be slight. You know, I'm not expecting Benjamin Netanyahu to think, well, the Liberal Democrats have said that we need an immediate bilateral ceasefire, so therefore we must have one. But it's clear that the UK still does have a degree of influence, and I suppose ultimately my position is that all wars eventually end with political and diplomatic solutions. That's how they all eventually conclude. And so therefore it's right and appropriate for the UK as part of that international community to continue to push for that. What we need to be quite clear on in terms of Russia-Ukraine is it is an illegal war that Russia is conducting. People, I'm sure in the audience and across Scotland have welcomed Ukrainian into their homes, and certainly they did not expect that they would still be here. And so it's a situation that clearly shows that the world is less stable than it has been for a long time. And as a result of that, you're going to the States next week. My big concern is if we do see a Trump presidency, that we will see further destabilisation. But if I just come on to the Middle East, I think the situation that we have in now with what has happened this week in relation to Lebanon and the missile attack by Iran is I think that the next step for Israel is to seriously consider what is the longer-term strategic aim of what is happening there, because clearly, if they choose to retaliate, then that is just going to further inflame the situation. I think if we are looking for what is the long-term solution in the Middle East, I would ask that is considered. But it's quite clear again that a two-state solution in relation to Palestine is the only way forward, even if that feels even longer away than it's ever been. So I reflect and accept that people do feel hopeless, and it does feel a less safe world than it has been for a long time, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to utilise the levers that we have.
Andrew.
Yeah, look, diplomacy is obviously key to everything moving forward. There's absolutely no way that we should cease our diplomatic efforts to try and resolve the crises that we see around the world, using the UK's voice as we have it at the UN Security Council. It's deeply depressing to see the weakness at the heart of the UN, caused in part by Russia and China and their constant undermining of the view of the vast majority of nations at the UN to find peaceful solutions to multiple crises across the world. Coming down the train from Aberdeen today, I was struck by why the conflict in Israel and Gaza actually started. And I was thinking back to Radio 1's big weekend that took place in May 2023 here in Dundee. And of course, just 5 months later, it was at a very similar music festival with a very similar type of person that one of the most horrific terrorist attacks that had ever been seen in the Middle East or indeed around the world was conducted. And I just thought that, had Dundee on that fantastic weekend in May 23 suffered an attack like that, you can very much understand the psychological impact that had on the people in the state of Israel. And we cannot forget that Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah, who are lobbing shells into northern Israel, are terrorist organisations.
And recognised as such by the UK.
And recognised as such by the UK government. And Israel is well within its right to defend itself and defend its people from further such attacks in the future.
A man in the black hoodie, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree that diplomatic efforts need to be better, but why is the UK still selling arms to Israel? Obviously, we've paused some of the contracts, but it's less than a tenth of arms contracts that we've stopped. We're essentially aiding and abetting a war. We're providing parts to jet fighter pilots, jet fighter airplanes that are still bombing Gaza. I don't understand that. Why are we doing it?
Okay. Woman with the blonde hair and the grey top.
I completely agree. I think this previous Conservative government and the current Labour government have not held Israel to account at all. They've continued to say it has the right to defend itself, but not hold any sort of boundaries to that whatsoever. And now it's progressed into 3 or 4 countries all across the Middle East. So when does defend yourself end? How many countries is Israel going to bomb before you finally stop selling arms to them and hold them to account?
Okay. Iain.
Well, you're right to be concerned because what we know after this week, after 200 ballistic missiles were fired from Tehran to Israel. The Middle Eastern war that everybody has been afraid of or has been forecasting is actually happening now. There's no doubt about it. Iran, through its proxies, the 3 H's, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Yemen, are fighting a war of extinction with Israel. Israel is never going to give up. The Hezbollah and the Hamas are never going to give up. So it's going to be a war. And I sometimes tire of hearing politicians, talking about a two-state solution or talking about some kind of ceasefire when they know perfectly well there isn't going to be one. And these wars only end in two ways. Either somebody wins, which is possible, or else both sides become so exhausted that they just give up and the war runs into the ground. And we're only really at the start of this process. It's going to be very, very damaging. It'll affect all of us. President Biden, in his own stumbling, bumbling way, gave the game away today when he said that that America is expecting Israel to now bomb not Iran's nuclear capability, but its oil and gas terminals. And that means the price of fuel is going to go up. Price of oil has already gone up 5%. It's gone up 10% this week as tensions have grown. So that's going to cost a lot of money for people here as well. And that will probably, I expect, to lead to some kind of retaliation from Iran. So that is going to go on. You've got these two powers. I mean, they won't rest until Israel is driven into the sea. That's what the Palestinian terrorists have been saying. They say from the river to the sea. They mean to get rid of Israel entirely. They want not a two-state solution. Hamas doesn't want a two-state solution. Neither does Hezbollah. They want a one-state solution. They want Israeli wiped off the face of the earth. And of course, half the Jews on the planet live in Israel. And after the history of persecution that the Jews have experienced over the last 2,000 years, you can be absolutely sure they're not going to give up. And we saw what they're capable of when they managed to blow up the pager devices of nearly all the Hamas activists, and they have systematically eliminated the Hezbollah leadership. And that's significant, very significant. That's why Iran has resorted to ballistic missiles. It is possible that if Israel does sufficiently suppress Iran's proxies, eliminates Hamas, I'm not excusing Israel's appalling behavior in Gaza and in the West Bank here, but I'm just saying, from a strategic point of view, if they do manage to eliminate Iran's proxies, there's a possibility that there might be a settlement there, because the Gulf states, remember, who were negotiating with Israel in the Abraham Accords before this happened, they don't want this war now to spread to the Gulf. They don't want oil terminals being bombed.
Let me bring the rest of the panel in.
There could be some kind of future on the other side of it, but it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Jenny.
Just briefly, to the lady's point in relation to arms sales to Israel, we've been pressing in the SNP for a ceasing of all arms sales to Israel. We welcome the fact that the UK government has taken some action in this space, but we want them to go further. To Jim's point, though, you're absolutely right, Jim. International diplomacy has completely failed in the Middle East. And the United Nations has been found wanting, not for the first time, if we consider a number of conflicts in recent history. You alluded to Russia, Ukraine, but there are others in recent history where the United Nations has not stepped up to take the action we might have expected it to. But I think we need to continue with an approach that encourages diplomacy, because that is the only route out of this. And, when we go back to the October the 7th attacks, we're approaching very soon the anniversary. Since that time, we in the SNP have been warning about the risk of contagion in the Middle East from that catastrophe in the Middle East, and how that will infect other parts of the countries surrounding. And we now see awful footage from Lebanon, from northern Israel and from Gaza, where nearly 2 million of the residents there are children. So we really, as an international community, need to come together. I don't think you will hear disagreement from the panellists on this tonight, and the UK government can play a key role in that regard. I should say that the former First Minister...
Is it a key role, though?
But the
given that it's, from what one can see, neither Hamas nor Hezbollah nor Israel are listening to the UK, to the Americans, to the UN,
but there has to be,
to anybody.
But Fiona, there has to be a diplomatic route out of this via the United Nations.
I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying when you say they have a key role, I'm just wondering how key it actually
not
is.
From the United Kingdom. But obviously, I think we also should be mindful of the point that was made in relation to the American elections and to what extent that will play into how America engages with this. And America have a key role to play here at the table. So we need to be very mindful of that and the urgency for that ceasefire and a two-state solution.
Iain. First of all, Jim's point is what else can possibly be done to stop this madness? Because at the moment, it doesn't seem that anyone is listening, and it's just happening. And we touched on this point last week. We've had 2 people now ask about arms sales to Israel, or certainly you did.
Jim raises a good question. We were chatting, Jim, in the green room before the start of the programme. It's 40th anniversary of the Brighton bombing. And we managed to find peace in Northern Ireland when it looked at that time as if it was so far away, and it was only diplomacy and politics that got us there. And, of course, people coming together to say enough is enough. And, you know, you've given the example of Crimea. When Crimea was annexed by the Russians, the international community didn't do anything. And look at where we've ended up with Ukraine and Russia. In the Middle East, it's only talking that's going to get this resolved. There is no bullets or bombs that are going to resolve the issues in the Middle East. We've got terrorist organisations that Iain has mentioned that are proxies for the Iranian regime in Russia. That will continue to play out. We've got a problem with the United Nations. It is a membership organisation, so the United Nations will have to do what the members want it to do. And, you know, it's right that China and Russia and they are agitating in the United Nations as well. So we have to find a way through this. And the Prime Minister was clear at the Labour Party conference. We need de-escalation. Now, you might feel powerless or hopeless when you say that, but actually you've just got to keep saying it. You've got to bring people together.
Well, to that point, would you like to answer the man's point there about... Strictly speaking, it's the UK government approving export licences for arms to be sold to Israel, and you've basically stopped some of them but allowed the majority of them to go through.
Well, the Prime Minister said in his first weekend in office that the rule of law is back in this country and we have to abide by international law. All our licences have been assessed under international law, and the 30 or so licences that were deemed to potentially be being used for the conflict in Israel-Palestine were suspended. So it's been done under the very international law that we're trying to guide ourselves by at the moment. If we want to guide ourselves by international law, and we always should, that should be the sacrosanct way that we do things, then you have to make sure that you're doing everything by that international law, and that's why 30 were suspended.
I could go more into this, and I know you want me to. We did this question last week, so that's the only reason I'm not going to go through it all again tonight, but thank you for your point. Let's move on, take another question, which a lot of you asked about. Iona, where are you, Iain? Yeah, Iona Wallace.
Scotland, particularly Dundee and Glasgow, has the highest rate of drug deaths in Europe. What can we do to tackle this?
So yes, Scotland has, as you say, the highest number of drug deaths per capita in Europe. People in Scotland are nearly 3 times more likely to die from drug misuse also than in England and Wales. Jenny, this can't be something as a record that the SNP are proud of.
No, it's not, and I think we should be mindful that the challenges we face in Scotland in relation to drug deaths are historic. They have grown up over a number of years, but there are real challenges here, and we saw the statistics last year show us making progress, but this year, unfortunately, we've moved backwards. We are investing as a government through supporting local authorities, through drug and alcohol partnerships, and through a mission-led approach. In Glasgow, actually, we're piloting a safe consumption room, which I think will make a huge difference. But there are real generational challenges here in relation to drug use in Scotland. We need to treat the causes to provide that support. We also know that poverty is directly linked to drug use, and we need to be mindful of the impact of austerity policies on those who live in the most vulnerable circumstances in some of our communities, here in Dundee, but also in Glasgow too. So we need to take a whole-scale government approach to helping to support families through some of the most challenging times.
And I presume you think that decriminalisation is part of the answer, because I know the Scottish Government challenged Westminster last year to decriminalise all drugs. How do you think that would help?
Well, look, I think in Scotland we follow a health-based approach. We want to support people and families, and we know that the best route forward is one that supports families to recovery. And that's why, of course, the Justice Secretary has been leading very much so on this mission-based approach, providing that additionality, as I say, to drug and alcohol partnerships. I, in my own constituency over in Leven, have a drug and alcohol partnership in Leven, which works really closely.
But just sticking to decriminalisation for a minute, because this is something that's SNP policy. There's been another big experiment about decriminalisation in Portland, Oregon, which I'm sure you're aware of. they've just voted to rescind that and recriminalise possession of drugs, because when they decriminalised it, overdose deaths rose by 1,500%. So given the appalling record of drug deaths in Scotland, why are you suggesting decriminalising it?
Well, there is other evidence to suggest that it can help, and I think it's important that we say that, well, let's look at the Glasgow pilot, for example. It's not yet started, so we want to take that pilot forward.
There yet?
No, there are other parts of the world that have used this approach, so I think we need to take a public health approach.
Where has it worked?
Well, look, Fiona, I think we need to take a public health approach. And
I've looked, I couldn't find anywhere where it's actually reduced drug consumption.
Our approach to tackling drug use in Scotland has been overtly criminal in the past, and that is the problem. So
OK, but I'm just suggesting if you want to decriminalise it, presumably that's because you think it works. I was just wondering, where has it worked?
Well, we want to test it in Glasgow to see how we can better support families and those people who have suffered from drug use for generations, Fiona. And I think taking a more public health approach to this is the right thing to do, not criminalising people, because we know it's harmed families in Scotland for generations. So this isn't a Scotland unique problem. We look, of course, at the
I'm not
evidence
suggesting
from
it is. I was just wondering why you thought decriminalisation was a good idea, given what we've seen in other countries. But Andrew?
Well, it's not a Scotland unique problem. Every nation in the United Kingdom, and indeed most countries in the world, are dealing with drugs deaths. But it is worse in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK, and indeed anywhere else in Europe. And yes, it's generational, but the SNP have been in power in Scotland for now 17 years, and drug deaths have only increased. So something is going dramatically wrong. You used international... The laws in Scotland are exactly the same when it comes to drugs as the laws around the rest of the UK. So what is it about the Scottish National Party's governance that let this get so bad? We in the Scottish Conservatives have brought forward what we're calling a right to recovery bill. We'd like to see the full-throated support of that from the Scottish Government. That would give residential rehabilitation an absolute right to those people seeking to come off their addiction. And we are supportive of the pilot in Glasgow. But as Fiona said, international comparisons demonstrate that where deregulation, where legalisation has occurred, in Portland, Oregon, for example, the very people that brought that in, expecting it to have a downward trend on drugs deaths, are actually revisiting that and actually bringing back laws to prevent those things happening. So I do think that the SNP have to look very hard at their record in government as to why we're in the situation right now, because families across this country are suffering, and we need to get it right for them.
All right. Well, I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say here, because, I mean, Glasgow has the highest number of deaths, but then it's Dundee. Dundee is second. So let's hear from somebody. The man, I think you've got a pink shirt or a white shirt in the glasses. Yes.
I don't see how decriminalisation is going to improve the situation, because these people are still going to need to get the money from somewhere to pay for these drugs. And at the moment, the impact on society is that they're stealing, they're breaking into houses, they're impacting on a far wider portion of the community than just themselves.
OK, and the man here in the blue sweater with the glasses, yeah.
There's been, the latest statistics show that there's been over 1,100 deaths from drug-related issues in Scotland in 2023.
Yeah.
The SNP have been in power for nearly 18 years. Now, they've indicated that that should have been going down, not in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
So what have they really been doing about it?
OK. Woman in the white top, yeah.
A lot of people forget that the Scottish government are under the powers of Westminster, so a lot of our decisions with drug policy and things like that comes from the Misuse of Drugs Act, and a lot of people do get decriminalisation and legalisation kind of mixed up in a way, and I do think that there's been a lot of pushback from the Conservatives to prevent good measures getting put in place, like the safe consumption room, and I think also people forget that the drug-related deaths that do occur are often because there's not these safe spaces to take drugs. That's where these deaths happen. So if we do not have those facilities in the first place, essentially, we can't really do much. And I do think the SNP are getting there. They're getting there slowly, but I think a lot of people need to look a bit more at Westminster and be like, why are they not helping us deal with this?
Wendy, let's look at you. You're at Westminster. Obviously, you're not in government. I know decriminalisation is also something you support.
For cannabis. For
cannabis only. Right.
But what I would say is, I mean, I was a police officer, started off in Wester Hailes in Edinburgh in 1999, and the people that we are seeing who are dying now in relation to drugs are people who were misusing drugs back then. They are people ages with myself and older, where they've had chronic drug use conditions, and potentially maybe have been in rehabilitation and been clean for some time, but then have fallen foul of comorbidities. So I think we need to be cognizant of that. And there was things that Jenny said that I agreed with, but I think my disagreement is at the point where, given that we have seen from the Scottish Government cuts to rehabilitation, cuts to bed spaces, etc., and cuts to criminal justice sector more generally, which means that, the gentleman referred to the crime that supports the drug industry, means that people have not been getting justice, victims have not been getting justice, but indeed offenders have not been identified quickly enough and get the support that they needed. Now, in terms of consumption rooms, I think there are examples, for example, in places
Should we just make clear, just in case
Portugal.
everyone's not familiar with what consumption rooms are, which is basically a place where you can go and you can take whatever substance it is. I mean, any drug, as I understand it, you can take safely. You're not going to get arrested in there. You can take it there. There will be medical staff there to make sure you do it
And that
safe.
is about thinking about that kind of chronic drug misuse as a health issue, because actually, in some respects, we're talking about the criminal aspects here, but we're also talking about the fact that we have got the highest drugs deaths in Europe, and clearly there is a health solution in relation to that. But in terms of the Misuse of Drugs Act, I would agree the Misuse of Drugs Act dates from 1971, because I remember all the searches that I did in relation to drugs in relation to that. That's over 50 years old. The types of drugs that we have, etc. Is there a need for a potential review of that?
OK, let me bring in the rest of the panel. Reasonably brief, if you would, because I need to get another question in.
Well, actually, the Scottish Government does have quite a bit of power here. I'm not sure people watching this programme will be fully aware that 3 years ago, the Lord Advocate effectively decriminalised the possession of hard drugs in Scotland. She made a statement to Parliament with the authority of the Scottish Government saying that she no longer expected the police to prosecute people who were found in simple possession of hard drugs like crack, cocaine, fentanyl, the rest of it. So that we do have effective decriminalisation already in Scotland. That was 3 years ago. Clearly, it hasn't made much of an impact. I used to support decriminalisation myself very much, partly because in Portugal in the early years of this century, it seemed to be working, and they seemed to be cutting the death rate very dramatically. But even in Portugal now, they are rethinking this, not just in Oregon, not just in Canada and Ontario and these places, where they've found that the consequences of this are just atrocious in terms of crime, in terms of kids, tripping over drug dealers on their way to school. It's really been a nightmare, and that's why Oregon, for example, is now recriminalising. It's a huge development that. And even in Portugal, where drug overdoses have doubled in the last 12 years, where they're finding that people are taking ketamine in extraordinary quantities, and where they have all the criminal problems associated with addiction. Now, we know what does work. Decriminalisation on its own certainly does not work. What does work is rehabilitation and treatment. And that's actually what the Portuguese were doing 20 years ago. And it's because of cuts, financial cuts, and what happened after the financial crisis, they've not been able to sustain these programs. But they do work. But the first thing you have to do, and anyone in the drug rehabilitation business will tell you, the first thing you have to do is enforce abstinence. People have to stop taking the drugs before you can work below that and find out what were the psychosocial problems that led to them taking drugs in the first place. They've got to get off the drugs. So just decriminalising, just making it easier to take drugs, I mean, I don't see why we think that's going to make it any better, because it just puts the power back in the hands of the drug cartels and the drug dealers.
Iain.
I think it's 1,172 deaths this year. I mean, that's 1,172 deaths too many. And it's incumbent on us all as politicians, whether in government or opposition, to try and find a way to make this better. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, the former First Minister, said maybe 3 or 4 years ago now that she thought the Scottish Government had taken their eye off the ball on this serious issue. I think the eye is still off the ball in this issue, and we've got to think about how society operates. It's a housing issue. We have a housing emergency declared by the Scottish Parliament in Scotland. We've got poverty rife in our communities. We've got funding for our local services have been decimated, local authority councils have been decimated.
How does austerity help that? Because you're signing up to the same cuts from the Tories.
No, there's no austerity.
There is austerity under Labour.
There is no austerity.
£22 billion of public sector cuts coming to... I'm sorry.
Let him answer.
We've been in power for 89 days. You've been in power for 17 years, and these figures are a disgrace. You should be ashamed of them. You should be ashamed of them.
All right.
You should be ashamed of them. We need to sort out our NHS in order to give those rehabilitation services. You cannot cut your way out of these particular deaths. You've got to invest in rehabilitation, invest in health, educational opportunities, training, reskilling, housing. This is a societal issue that has to be dealt with, and it's not going to be easy to deal with it. We're determined to make sure we can deal with all these issues. That's what we set out in our manifesto at the general election, and we're determined to see that through.
All right, let me squeeze in one last question. Quite a good few of you asked about this. Robin Halley. There you are.
Labour plan to increase the windfall tax on the North Sea oil and gas operators. Will this tax destroy the industry?
Can I just... Do you have a particular interest in this industry? Is that why you're asking?
Well, I do, yes. I mean, I have a lot of friends that are in the industry. I used to work in and around the industry myself. And I just believe that we're putting our energy security at risk. I don't believe, I don't think Labour understand the basic law of economics here, where the more you tax something, the less you get of it. So that means that they're taxing the industry to oblivion. The oil and gas operators are leaving the industry. We're not going to... they're not going to get the tax revenues they expected. GB Energy are expecting to get 8.5 billion out of the windfall tax of the gas operators. They'll be lucky if they get a fraction of that, because there'll be nothing to tax.
Let's ask. We've only got about 8 minutes left this programme. I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to have a say. So the Conservative policy under the previous government, the windfall tax was 75% of profits. Labour plans to raise that by 3% to 78%. And also at the moment, because this is still plans, hasn't come through, there's tax relief on investment by oil and gas companies, and Labour is intending to remove either that in part or in whole. Andrew?
Yes, I'm afraid it is going to destroy the industry, and I'm also afraid that is the whole point of what Labour are seeking to do. They're going to increase the energy profits levy, extend the energy profits levy, remove the investment allowances, which will undermine our energy security, actually damage the drive towards more clean energy in the future, because the very companies that are developing the technologies, that are employing the skilled workforce in the oil and gas industry right now, are the ones who are going to be delivering the new technologies of the future to drive us towards a cleaner energy solution. Ed Miliband has said that they're banning new licences in the North Sea, and what we're going to see is tens of thousands of jobs, especially important in Dundee, Aberdeen and around the rest of the northeast of Scotland, lost, sacrificed on the altar of eco-zealotry for no reason other than this drive to get to a net zero grid, a green grid by 2030, an arbitrary target that nobody seems to think will actually be met. And there's been absolutely no realistic consideration within the government as to the impact that will be felt on the communities that are so heavily reliant on the oil and gas industry for their economies locally and nationally. So I do think it's going to destroy the industry, but sadly, I think that's the whole point.
This is a very important topic, but you're all going to have to be pretty brief, because I've only got 6 minutes left of the programme. Wendy?
Yeah, I think the issue that we have here is that oil and gas is needed to achieve the just transition, because as Andrew said, there are companies who are working in the industry who will deliver the clean energy.
So you think
there are people within the skill sets.
So just to be clear, in your manifesto, because we haven't got much time left, you think there should be a proper, in inverted commas, windfall tax. How much is that?
Yeah, well,
is it 75%? Is it 78%?
Well, it's about properly ensuring that we do the taxes in relation to...
So what should it be?
Well, I can't remember the exact from the manifesto in terms of the amount.
It didn't have the amount in it, as far as I'm aware. It just said a proper windfall tax.
Because there was issues around the government, the UK government, the previous UK government did not implement in the way they expected.
So you don't...
But I think we have this recognition that you need, to achieve the transition that we want to see to clean energy, that you need to have, there is a role for oil and gas within it.
Okay, so there should be windfall tax.
Is in terms
you have to be really brief for us, no one else is going to get a chance.
Is the fact that the Scottish Government have a role to play here. We have seen the fact that the ScotWind auction but Kitty has already been emptied by the Scottish Government to balance the budget.
But
and we need to change the demand profile, and the Scottish Government's got a role to play in that.
So you also support a windfall tax, but not sure by how much. Jenny?
Well, I thought that end point from Wendy was really interesting. The reason, of course, we've had to use the ScotWind funding is to plug the financial gap created by financial recklessness from Westminster. which created sky-high inflation and meant we had to settle. And meant we had
the
to
question,
settle.
just to focus minds, is about the windfall tax. Do you agree that there should be windfall tax?
We
and do you
agree
agree
with the financial
78%?
levy. The financial levy, the powers rather round about this sit with the Westminster government, so I think it's important to say that.
We did.
We did.
Just because,
but unlike you, though.
Hang on. This was the question. Don't all talk at the same time. This is the question you were asked. Do Labour plans to increase the windfall tax? Do you support it?
We do support it.
At 78%?
Well, I don't think we've given a percentage on it, but I'm not going to be drawn on that.
Just asking.
I think the point is what you do with that windfall tax. What's the purpose of it? So I think Andrew's party want to fund tax cuts for the rich. Iain's party want to use it to build new nuclear power stations.
No, we don't.
And we want to use it to help people to create jobs, because we have, to that man's point, a just transition. My brother-in-law works in the industry. I represent a constituency over the water, which was decimated when the mining industry closed. We cannot leave these workers out of employment. We have to fund that just transition.
Iain, you're going to have to be really quick.
Well, we've already seen the impact, haven't we? Grangemouth is closing. Now, that was Scotland's last petrochemical plant. It processed fuel that came from the North Sea, processed crude oil that came from the North Sea through the Forties field. Still processing 60% of the diesel and petrol that's used in the central belt of Scotland came from there. It's going to close now. And what's going to happen? It's going to become a terminal, effectively, a receiving point for liquefied natural gas, which is coming from tankers from America, where it's derived from fracking, which is banned in this country. Now, that's not a just transition. That's a just transition of fools.
Iain.
I mean, just briefly, Grangemouth is much more complicated than that, and we've been working very closely with the Scottish Government to find a solution. But look, the oil and gas sector have been raking in billions and billions of pounds of profits, and those with the broadest shoulders should pay their fair share into the kitty. Increasing the tax to 78% equalises it with what's happening in Norway. That money will be put into GB Energy. That money will be put into GB Energy, which is a publicly owned energy company owned by the taxpayer. So all the profits and all the benefits from that will go back into the public purse to be reinvested in clean energy. And we have to get to clean green energy by 2030, because if we don't, bills will keep going up. We're reliant on Russian oligarchs.
Right now.
But the GB Energy has only just been announced to be in Aberdeen. We've been in for 89 days. You had 14 years and you had 17 years and we're in a mess. So give us... We've had 89 days.
We reduced our carbon emissions by half and still had a profitable oil and gas sector.
We've had 89 days to get this sorted out.
Well, how will GB Energy
You guys take responsibility for the mess you made of the economy.
How will GB Energy cut bills?
Hang on.
Please explain how GB Energy will cut bills.
If you talk at the same time, no one can understand anything
It's really
you're saying.
important for the workers in the North East and for the oil and gas industry that oil and gas will be with us in this country for decades and decades to come. It's an ageing basin. The industry itself is transitioning to renewables. Yes. Oil and Gas UK used to be the name for which is now Overseas Energies UK. The industry body has transitioned its own name.
Yes, and they're deeply critical of the moves that this government are making.
So we need to get GB Energy up and running. We need to get to that target of clean power by 2030 to lower bills, make sure we can get that just transition, and make sure we can meet our climate targets. It's as simple and straightforward as that.
I've got a minute left. Yes, the man in the green sweater.
There is a lot of wealth in the oil industry.
Indeed.
So I'm not surprised to hear a Tory complain about taxing the wealthy.
Okay. Yes, the woman in the white sweater. Yes.
My view on this is that, yeah, OK, we need to be taking money back from all these high flyers, as I would call them. However, why is our energy still going up and up and up every 6 months?
That's the challenge.
And I'm a pensioner, and you're taking money back from me. I can't afford to heat my home properly.
Ed Miliband.
So, what are you going to do with that money?
There's two challenges.
Ed Miliband said,
hang on.
Miliband said he was going to cut fuel prices energy prices by £300. Is that true?
Well, that was an independent analysis that was done on the basis of getting to clean power by
Labour candidate said it.
Hang on. No, I'm going to stop you because we're completely out of time. We have overrun, so I'm really sorry about that. You deserved a better answer, but we've just run out of time, so forgive me for that. Oh, that's all for this week. We're going to give that subject more time next time. Next Thursday, as I said, we are in Philadelphia. Remember, we are live on iPlayer at 8 o'clock every Thursday. Thank you very much for these pictures of Dundee to Stephen Niche. Much appreciated. See you next week. Bye-bye. Oh, my goodness.
Discussing the Chagos Islands, a possible bill on assisted dying, and the Tory leadership contenders next on BBC One in Newscast.